Hello everyone, and a warm welcome back to BookWaves, where our story in Cranford continues. In this next chapter of our journey with Elizabeth Gaskell, a mysterious visitor arrives, promising a night of magic and wonder the likes of which the town has never seen. We are about to meet the great Signor Brunoni. This section of the novel, covering Chapter 9 to Chapter 11, takes us on a remarkable emotional ride. We begin with excitement and curiosity, which soon gives way to a wave of unprecedented fear that grips the entire community, a time that will come to be known as the Great Cranford Panic. But what shocking discovery lies at the heart of this mystery? And how does it cause the town's terror to transform, almost overnight, into profound and heartfelt compassion? It is a beautiful testament to the true character of this unforgettable town. As always, your thoughts and comments are a welcome part of our reading experience, and a little preview of the dramatic events to come is waiting for you in the description box. Thank you for being here. Let us now see what the Signor has in store for Cranford. Chapter 9. Soon after the events of which I last gave an account, I was summoned home by my father's illness. For a time, in my anxiety about him, I forgot to wonder how my dear friends at Cranford were getting on, or how Lady Glenmire could reconcile herself to the dullness of the long visit she was still paying to her sister-in-law, Mrs. Jameson. When my father grew a little stronger, I accompanied him to the seaside. Altogether, I seemed banished from Cranford and was deprived of the opportunity of hearing any chance intelligence of the dear little town for the greater part of that year. Late in November, when we had returned home again and my father was once more in good health, I received a letter from Miss Mattie. It was a very mysterious letter indeed. She began many sentences without ending them, running them one into another in the same confused sort of way that written words run together on blotting paper. From what I could make out, she hoped my father was better, and would take warning to wear a heavy coat from Michaelmas to Lady Day. Then she wished to know if turbans were in fashion. Such a piece of gaiety was going to happen as had not been seen since the time Womwell's lions came to town. She felt she was perhaps too old to care about dress, but a new cap she must have. Having heard that turbans were worn, and that some of the county families were likely to come, she wanted to look tidy. She asked if I would bring her a cap from the milliner I employed. And then she lamented her carelessness for forgetting that the main purpose of her letter was to beg me to come and pay her a visit next Tuesday. She hoped to have something to offer me in the way of amusement, which she would not describe more particularly, only that sea green was her favorite color. She ended her letter so, but in a postscript she added that she might as well tell me the peculiar attraction. Signor Brunoni was going to exhibit his wonderful magic in the Cranford Assembly Rooms on Wednesday and Friday evening in the following week. I was very glad to accept the invitation from my dear Miss Mattie, independently of the conjurer. I was also particularly anxious to prevent her from disfiguring her small, gentle, mousy face with a great Saracen-style turban. Accordingly, I bought her a pretty, neat cap, suitable for a woman of middle age. It was, however, rather a disappointment to her. When I arrived, she followed me into my bedroom, ostensibly to poke the fire, but in reality, I do believe, to see if the sea green turban was not inside the cap box with which I had traveled. It was in vain that I twirled the cap round on my hand to show the back and side fronts. Her heart had been set upon a turban. All she could do was to say, with resignation in her look and voice, that she was sure I had done my best. She remarked that it was just like the caps all the ladies in Cranford were wearing, and they had likely had theirs for a year. She confessed she would have liked something newer, something more like the turbans Miss Betty Barker had told her Queen Adelaide wears. But she finished by saying it was very pretty, and that lavender would likely wear better than sea green anyway. After all, she mused, what was dress that they should care so much about it? She told me to let her know if I wanted anything, and pointed to the bell. Then, with a final sigh, she supposed that turbans had not yet come down to Drumble. So saying, the dear old lady gently bemoaned herself out of the room. She left me to dress for the evening, informing me that she expected Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester, and hoped I would not feel too tired to join the party. Of course, I would not. I made some haste to unpack and arrange my dress, but with all my speed I heard the arrivals and the buzz of conversation in the next room before I was ready. Just as I opened the door, I caught a snippet of conversation. I heard someone say they were foolish to expect anything very genteel out of the Drumble shops, but that the poor girl had no doubt done her best. For all that, I would rather she had blamed Drumble and me than disfigured herself with a turban. Miss Pole was always the person, in the trio of Cranford ladies now assembled, to have had adventures. She was in the habit of spending the morning rambling from shop to shop, not to purchase anything, except an occasional reel of cotton or a piece of tape, but to see the new articles and report upon them, and to collect all the stray pieces of intelligence in the town. She also had a way of demurely popping in and out of all sorts of places to gratify her curiosity on any point. It was a way which might have been considered impertinent if she had not looked so very genteel and prim. And now, by the expressive way in which she cleared her throat and waited for all minor subjects like caps and turbans to be cleared off the course, we knew she had something very particular to relate. And when the due pause came, as it always does, I defy any people of common modesty to keep up a conversation for long when one among them sits up aloft in silence, looking down upon all they say as trivial and contemptible compared to what they could disclose if properly entreated, and so Miss Pole began her story. She began her story by explaining that as she was stepping out of Gordon's shop that day, she chanced to go into the George Inn. She added a side note that her maid Betty had a second cousin who was a chambermaid there, and she thought Betty would like to hear how she was doing. Not seeing anyone about, she had strolled up the staircase and found herself in the passage leading to the assembly room. She reminisced with Miss Mattie for a moment about the room and the courtly minuets they used to dance there. She then continued, saying she went on, not thinking of what she was about, when all at once she perceived that she was in the middle of the preparations for the following night's performance. The room was divided with great frames for drying clothes, over which some men were tacking red flannel. It all seemed very dark and odd, and it quite bewildered her. She was going on behind the screens in her absence of mind when a gentleman, A man who was quite the gentleman, she assured us, stepped forward and asked if he could arrange any business for her. He spoke such pretty, broken English that she could not help thinking of the heroes from romantic novels, and while she was busy picturing his past life to herself, he had bowed her out of the room. But she urged us to wait, as that was not half her story. She was going downstairs when she met her maid's second cousin. Of course, she stopped to speak to her for Betty's sake, and it was the cousin who told her that she had really seen the conjurer. The gentleman who spoke broken English was Signor Brunoni himself. Just at that moment, he passed them on the stairs, making a most graceful bow. In reply, she had dropped a curtsy, remarking to us how all foreigners have such polite manners that one catches something of it. But when he had gone downstairs, she remembered that she had dropped her glove in the assembly room, though it was safe in her muff the whole time. So she went back. And just as she was creeping up the passage on one side of the great screen, she saw the very same gentleman from before. He was coming forward from the inner part of the room, to which, she reminded Miss Mattie, there was no entrance. He was repeating his inquiry in his pretty, broken English, and seemed very determined that she should not pass the screen. So, of course, she explained about her glove, which, curiously enough, she found at that very moment. So, Miss Pole had seen the conjurer, the real, live conjurer, and numerous were the questions we all asked her. We wanted to know if he had a beard, if he was young or old, fair or dark. Unable to shape my own question prudently, I simply asked how he looked. In short, Miss Pole was the heroine of the evening, owing to her morning's encounter. If she was not the rose, that is to say, the conjurer, she had certainly been near it. Conjuration, sleight of hand, magic, and witchcraft were the subjects of the evening. Miss Pole was slightly skeptical and inclined to think there might be a scientific solution found for even the proceedings of the Witch of Endor. Mrs. Forrester believed everything, from ghosts to the ticking sounds that were said to foretell a death. Miss Mattie ranged between the two, always convinced by the last speaker. I think she was naturally more inclined to Mr. Forrester's side, but a desire to prove herself a worthy sister to Miss Jenkins kept her equally balanced. For Miss Jenkins would never allow a servant to speak of the little rolls of tallow that formed themselves round candles as winding sheets, a term for a burial shroud, but insisted on their being called roly-polies. A sister of hers being superstitious was something that would never do. After tea, I was dispatched downstairs into the dining parlor for that volume of the old encyclopedia which contained the nouns beginning with the letter C. This was so that Miss Pole might prime herself with scientific explanations for the tricks of the following evening. It spoiled the pool at preference which Miss Mattie and Mr. Forrester had been looking forward to. Miss Pole became so much absorbed in her subject and the plates by which it was illustrated that we felt it would be cruel to disturb her other than by one or two well-timed yawns, which I threw in now and then. I was really touched by the meek way in which the two ladies were bearing their disappointment. But Miss Pole only read the more zealously. She imparted to us no more information than to exclaim that she saw it now. She comprehended perfectly. She described a process involving the letters A, B, C, D, and F, and the turning of a finger joint. She declared to Mrs. Forrester that conjuring and witchcraft were a mere affair of the alphabet, and asked to read her just one passage. Mrs. Forrester implored Miss Pole to spare her, saying she had never been able to understand being read aloud to. At this, I dropped the pack of cards, which I had been shuffling very audibly. By this discreet movement, I obliged Miss Pole to perceive that preference was to have been the order of the evening. She then proposed, rather unwillingly, that the pool should commence. A pleasant brightness stole over the other two ladies' faces on this. Miss Mattie had one or two twinges of self-reproach for having interrupted Miss Pole in her studies. She did not remember her cards well or give her full attention to the game until she had soothed her conscience by offering to lend the volume of the encyclopedia to Miss Pole, who accepted it thankfully. The next evening, we were all in a little gentle flutter at the idea of the gaiety before us. Miss Mattie went up to dress early and hurried me until I was ready. We then found we had an hour and a half to wait before the doors opened at 7 precisely, and we had only 20 yards to go. However, as Miss Mattie said, it would not do to get too much absorbed in anything and forget the time, so she thought we had better sit quietly, without lighting the candles, until 5 minutes to 7. So Miss Mattie dozed, and I knitted. At length we set off. At the door under the carriageway at the George Inn, we met Mrs. Forrester and Miss Pole. The latter was discussing the subject of the evening with more vehemence than ever, throwing letters like X and B at our heads like hailstones. She had even copied one or two of the receipts, as she called them, for the different tricks on the backs of letters, ready to explain and to detect Signor Brunoni's arts. We went into the cloakroom adjoining the assembly room. Miss Mattie gave a sigh or two to her departed youth, and the remembrance of the last time she had been there, as she adjusted her pretty new cap before the strange, quaint old mirror. The assembly room had been added to the inn about 100 years before by the different county families. They met together there once a month during the winter to dance and play at cards. Many a county beauty had first swung through the minuet that she afterwards danced before Queen Charlotte in this very room. It was said that one of the famous Gunning sisters had graced the apartment with her beauty. It was certain that a rich and beautiful widow, Lady Williams, had here been smitten with the noble figure of a young artist who was staying with some family in the neighborhood for professional purposes. And a pretty bargain poor Lady Williams had of her handsome husband, if all tales were true. Now, no beauty blushed and dimpled along the sides of the Cranford assembly room. No handsome artist won hearts by his bow, with his hat held in his hand. The old room was dingy. The salmon-colored paint had faded into a drab. Great pieces of plaster had chipped off from the fine wreaths and festoons on its walls, but still a moldy odor of aristocracy lingered about the place. And a dusty recollection of the days that were gone made Miss Mattie and Mrs. Forrester hold their heads up high as they entered and walk mincingly up the room as if there were a number of genteel observers instead of two little boys with a stick of toffee between them. We stopped short at the second front row. I could hardly understand why, until I heard Miss Pole ask a stray waiter if any of the county families were expected. When he shook his head and said he believed not, Mrs. Forrester and Miss Mattie moved forwards, and our party represented a conversational square. The front row was soon augmented and enriched by Lady Glenmire and Mrs. Jameson. We 6 occupied the 2 front rows, and our aristocratic seclusion was respected by the groups of shopkeepers who strayed in from time to time and huddled together on the back benches. At least I conjectured so, from the noise they made and the sonorous bumps they gave in sitting down. But when, in weariness of the obstinate green curtain that would not draw up, but would stare at me with 2 odd eyes seen through holes, I would fain have looked round at the merry, chattering people behind me. Miss Pole clutched my arm. She begged me not to turn, for it was not the proper thing to do. What the thing was, I never could find out, but it must have been something eminently dull and tiresome. However, we all sat with our eyes to the front, in a square, gazing at the tantalizing curtain. We hardly spoke intelligibly. We were so afraid of being caught in the vulgarity of making any noise in a place of public amusement. Mrs. Jameson was the most fortunate, for she fell asleep. At length, the eyes in the curtain disappeared. The curtain quivered. One side went up before the other, which stuck fast. It was dropped again, and with a fresh effort and a vigorous pull from some unseen hand, it flew up. It revealed to our sight a magnificent gentleman in the Turkish costume, seated before a little table, gazing at us with what I believe were the same eyes I had last seen through the hole in the curtain. He regarded us with calm and condescending dignity. Behind me, I heard a sentimental voice ejaculate that he was like a being from another sphere. Miss Pole stated decisively that this was not Signor Brunoni. She said it so audibly that I am sure he heard, for he glanced down over his flowing beard at our party with an air of mute reproach. She then reasoned to herself that Signor Brunoni had no beard, but that perhaps he would come soon, and so she lulled herself into patience. Meanwhile, Miss Mattie had looked through her eyeglass, wiped it, and looked again. Then she turned round and remarked to me, in a kind, mild, and sorrowful tone, that, as I could see, turbans were indeed being worn. But we had no time for more conversation. The Grand Turk, as Miss Pole chose to call him, arose and announced himself as Signor Brunoni. Miss Pole exclaimed in a defiant manner that she did not believe him. He looked at her again with the same dignified upbraiding in his countenance. She repeated more positively than ever that she did not believe it. She insisted that Signor Brunoni had not got that muffy sort of thing about his chin, but had looked like a clean-shaven Christian gentleman. Miss Pole's energetic speeches had the good effect of wakening up Mrs. Jameson, who opened her eyes wide in a sign of the deepest attention. This proceeding silenced Miss Pole and encouraged the Grand Turk to proceed. This he did in very broken English, so broken that there was no cohesion between the parts of his sentences. He perceived this himself at last, and so left off speaking and proceeded to action. Now we were astonished. I could not imagine how he did his tricks, not even when Miss Pole pulled out her pieces of paper and began reading in a very audible whisper the separate receipts for the most common of his tricks. If ever I saw a man frown and look enraged, I saw the Grand Turk frown at Miss Pole. But, as she said, what could be expected but unchristian looks from a man who was not a Christian? If Miss Pole was skeptical, and more engrossed with her diagrams than with his tricks, Miss Mattie and Mrs. Forrester were mystified and perplexed to the highest degree. Mrs. Jameson kept taking her spectacles off and wiping them, as if she thought it was something defective in them which made the legerdemain. And Lady Glenmire, who had seen many curious sights in Edinburgh, was very much struck with the tricks. She would not at all agree with Miss Pole, who declared that anybody could do them with a little practice, and that she would, herself, undertake to do all he did. With 2 hours given to study the encyclopedia and make her third finger flexible. At last, Miss Matty and Mrs. Forrester became perfectly awe-stricken. They whispered together. I sat just behind them, so I could not help but hear what they were saying. Miss Matty asked Mrs. Forrester if she thought it was quite right to have come to see such things. She confessed she could not help fearing they were lending encouragement to something that was not quite proper, her thought trailing off as she gave a little shake of her head. Mrs. Forrester replied that the same thought had crossed her mind. She too was feeling very uncomfortable, as it was all so very strange. She was quite certain that it was her own pocket handkerchief which had been in that loaf of bread just now, though it had been in her hand not 5 minutes before. She wondered who had furnished the bread, and was sure it could not be Dakin, because he was the churchwarden. Suddenly, Miss Matty half turned towards me. She asked me, as a stranger in the town who would not give rise to unpleasant reports, if I would just look round and see if the rector was there. She explained that if he was present, she thought they might conclude that this wonderful man was sanctioned by the church, which would be a great relief to her mind. I looked, and I saw the tall, thin, dusty rector sitting surrounded by the boys from the national school. He was guarded by troops of his own sex from any approach of the many Cranford spinsters. His kind face was all agape with broad smiles, and the boys around him were in fits of laughing. I told Miss Matty that the church was smiling its approval, which set her mind at ease. I have never named Mr. Hayter, the rector, because as a young woman who was well off and happy, I never came in contact with him. He was an old bachelor, but as afraid of reports about matrimony getting abroad about him as any girl of 18. He would rush into a shop or dive down an entry sooner than encounter any of the Cranford ladies in the street. As for the preference parties, I did not wonder at his not accepting invitations to them. To tell the truth, I always suspected Miss Pole of having given a very vigorous chase to Mr. Hayter when he first came to Cranford. This was not lessened by the fact that she now appeared to share so vividly in his dread lest her name should ever be coupled with his. He found all his interests among the poor and helpless. He had treated the national schoolboys to the performance this very night, and virtue was for once its own reward, for they guarded him right and left and clung round him as if he had been the queen bee and they the swarm. He felt so safe in their environment that he could even afford to give our party a bow as we filed out. Miss Pole ignored his presence and pretended to be absorbed in convincing us that we had been cheated and had not seen Signor Brunoni after all. Chapter 10. I think a series of circumstances dated from Signor Brunoni's visit to Cranford. At the time, they seemed connected in our minds with him, though I do not know that he really had anything to do with them. All at once, all sorts of uncomfortable rumors got afloat in the town. There were 1 or 2 robberies, real and genuine robberies, with men brought up before the magistrates and committed for trial. and that seemed to make us all afraid of being robbed. For a long time at Miss Mattie's, I know we used to make a regular expedition all round the kitchens and cellars every night. Miss Mattie would lead the way, armed with the poker, while I followed with the hearth brush, and Martha carried the shovel and fire irons with which to sound the alarm. By the accidental hitting together of them, she often frightened us so much that we bolted ourselves up, all three together, in the back kitchen or the storeroom or wherever we happened to be. When our fright was over, we recollected ourselves and set out afresh with double valiance. By day, we heard strange stories from the shopkeepers and cottagers. They spoke of carts that went about in the dead of night, drawn by horses that were shod with felt, and guarded by men in dark clothes, going round the town, no doubt in search of some unwatched house or some unfastened door. Miss Pole, who affected great bravery herself, was the principal person to collect and arrange these reports so as to make them assume their most fearful aspect. But we discovered that she had begged one of Mr. Hoggins' hats, one that was quite worn out, to hang up in her lobby. And we, at least I, had doubts as to whether she really would enjoy the little adventure of having her house broken into, as she protested she would. Miss Mattie made no secret of being an arrant coward, but she went regularly through her duty of inspection as the housekeeper. Only the hour for this became earlier and earlier, until at last we went the rounds at 6:30, and Miss Mattie adjourned to bed soon after 7, in order to get the night over with sooner. Cranford had so long prided itself on being an honest and moral town that it had grown to fancy itself too genteel and well-bred to be otherwise. It felt the stain upon its character at this time doubly. But we comforted ourselves with the assurance which we gave to each other that the robberies could never have been committed by any Cranford person. It must have been a stranger or strangers who brought this disgrace upon the town. They occasioned as many precautions as if we were living among the native peoples of America or the French. This last comparison of our nightly state of defense and fortification was made by Mrs. Forrester. Her father had served under General Burgoyne in the American War, and her husband had fought the French in Spain. She indeed inclined to the idea that, in some way, the French were connected with the small thefts, which were ascertained facts, and the burglaries and highway robberies, which were rumors. She had been deeply impressed with the idea of French spies at some time in her life, and the notion could never be fairly eradicated. And now her theory was this: the Cranford people respected themselves too much to ever be dishonest or immoral. Therefore, the robbers must be strangers. If strangers, why not foreigners? If foreigners, who so likely as the French? She reasoned that Signor Brunoni spoke broken English like a Frenchman. And though he wore a turban like a Turk, she had seen a print of Madame de Staël with a turban on, and another of Mr. Denon in just such a dress, showing clearly that the French also wore turbans. There could be no doubt, she concluded, that Signor Brunoni was a Frenchman, a French spy come to discover the weak and undefended places of England, and he doubtless had his accomplices. For her part, she had always had her own opinion of Miss Pole's adventure at the George Inn, where 2 men were seen but only one was believed to be. French people, she was thankful to say, had ways and means which the English knew nothing about. She had never felt quite easy in her mind about going to see that conjurer. It was rather too much like a forbidden thing, even though the rector was there. In short, Mr. Forrester grew more excited than we had ever known her before, and being an officer's daughter and widow, we naturally looked up to her opinion. Really, I do not know how much was true or false in the reports which flew about like wildfire at this time. But it seemed to me then that there was every reason to believe that at Marden, a small town about 8 miles from Cranford, houses and shops were being entered by holes made in the walls. The bricks were silently carried away in the dead of night, and all was done so quietly that no sound was heard. Miss Mattie gave up in despair when she heard of this. She questioned what the use was of locks and bolts and bells on the windows and going round the house every night. That last trick, she felt, was fit for a conjurer. And now she did believe that Signor Brunoni was at the bottom of it. One afternoon, about 5 o'clock, we were startled by a hasty knock at the door. Miss Mattie bade me run and tell Martha on no account to open the door until she had reconnoitered through the window. She armed herself with a footstool to drop down on the head of the visitor in case he should show a face covered with black crape, but it was nobody but Miss Pole and Betty. The former came upstairs carrying a little handbasket, and she was evidently in a state of great agitation. As I offered to relieve Miss Pole of her basket, she warned me to take care of it, explaining that it contained her plate. She was sure there was a plan to rob her house that night. She announced that she had come to throw herself on Miss Mattie's hospitality. Her maid, Betty, was going to sleep with her cousin at the George Inn. She asked if she might sit up here all night, explaining that her house was so far from any neighbors that she did not believe they could be heard if they screamed. Miss Mattie asked what had alarmed her so much, and if she had seen any men lurking about the house. Miss Pole answered that, oh yes, she had. She described how 2 men who looked very bad had gone past the house 3 times, very slowly. Then, not even half an hour ago, an Irish beggar woman had come and all but forced herself in past Betty. The woman had claimed her children were starving and that she must speak to the mistress. Miss Pole pointed out the significance of the woman using the word mistress, though a man's hat was hanging in the hall. But Betty had shut the door in her face and come up to her. They had gathered the spoons together and sat in the parlor window watching until they saw Thomas Jones going from his work. They had called to him and asked him to take care of them on their way into town. We might have triumphed over Miss Pole, who had professed such bravery, until she was frightened, but we were too glad to perceive that she shared in the weaknesses of humanity to exult over her. I gave up my room to her very willingly and shared Miss Mattie's bed for the night. But before we retired, the 2 ladies rummaged up, from the recesses of their memory, such horrid stories of robbery and murder that I quite quaked in my shoes. Miss Pole was evidently anxious to prove that such terrible events had occurred within her experience that she was justified in her sudden panic. Miss Mattie did not like to be outdone and capped every story with one yet more horrible. It reminded me, oddly enough, of an old story I had read somewhere, of a nightingale and a musician who strove one against the other to see which could produce the most admirable music, until poor Philomel dropped down dead. One of the stories that haunted me for a long time afterwards was of a girl who was left in charge of a great house in Cumberland on a particular day of a fair when the other servants all went off to the gaieties. The family was away in London. A peddler came by and asked to leave his large and heavy pack in the kitchen, saying he would call for it again at night. The girl, who was the daughter of a gamekeeper, was roaming about in search of amusement. She chanced to hit upon a gun hanging up in the hall and took it down to look at the chasing. It went off through the open kitchen door, hit the pack, and a slow, dark thread of blood came oozing out. I recall how Miss Pole enjoyed this part of the story, dwelling on each word as if she loved it. She rather hurried over the further account of the girl's bravery. I have but a confused idea that, somehow, she baffled the robbers with Italian irons, which were heated until they were glowing red, and then restored to blackness by being dipped in grease. We parted for the night with a feeling of awe-struck wonder as to what we should hear of in the morning, and, on my part, there was a vehement desire for the night to be over and gone. I was so afraid that the robbers might have seen from some dark, lurking place that Miss Pole had carried off her plate, and thus have a double motive for attacking our house. But until Lady Glenmire came to call the next day, we heard of nothing unusual. The kitchen fire irons were in exactly the same position against the back door as when Martha and I had skillfully piled them up, ready to fall with an awful clatter if only a cat had touched the outside panels. I had wondered what we should all do if we were awakened and alarmed in such a way. I had proposed to Miss Mattie that we should cover up our faces under the bedclothes so that there should be no danger of the robbers thinking that we could identify them. But Miss Mattie, who was trembling very much, scouted this idea. She said we owed it to society to apprehend them, and that she should certainly do her best to lay hold of them and lock them up in the garret until morning. When Lady Glenmire came, we almost felt jealous of her. Mrs. Jamieson's house had really been attacked. At least there were men's footsteps to be seen on the flower borders underneath the kitchen windows where, as the old saying goes, no men should be. And Carlo had barked all through the night as if strangers were abroad. Mrs. Jamieson had been awakened by Lady Glenmire, and they had rung the bell which communicated with Mr. Mulliner's room in the third story. When his head, with a nightcap on, had appeared over the banisters in answer to the summons, they had told him of their alarm and the reasons for it. Whereupon, he retreated into his bedroom and locked the door, informing them in the morning that it was for fear of draughts, and opened the window. He called out valiantly, saying that if the supposed robbers would come to him, he would fight them. But, as Lady Glenmire observed, that was but poor comfort, since they would have to pass by Mrs. Jamieson's room and her own before they could reach him. They must be of a very pugnacious disposition indeed if they neglected the opportunities of robbery presented by the unguarded lower stories to go up to a garret and there force a door in order to get at the champion of the house. Lady Glenmire, after waiting and listening for some time in the drawing-room, had proposed to Mrs. Jamieson that they should go to bed. But that lady said she should not feel comfortable unless she sat up and watched. Accordingly, she packed herself warmly up on the sofa, where she was found by the housemaid at 6 o'clock in the morning, fast asleep. But Lady Glenmire went to bed and kept awake all night. When Miss Pole heard of this, she nodded her head in great satisfaction. She had been sure they would hear of something happening in Cranford that night, and they had heard. It was clear enough, she reasoned, that they had first proposed to attack her house. But when they saw that she and Betty were on their guard and had carried off the plate, they had changed their tactics and gone to Mrs. Jameson's, and no one knew what might have happened if Carlo had not barked like a good dog as he was. Poor Carlo. His barking days were nearly over. Whether the gang who infested the neighborhood were afraid of him, or whether they were revengeful enough to poison him for the way in which he had baffled them on the night in question, or whether, as some among the less educated people thought, he died of apoplexy, brought on by too much feeding and too little exercise, it is certain that, 2 days after this eventful night, Carlo was found dead. His poor legs were stretched out stiff in the attitude of running, as if by such unusual exertion he could escape the sure pursuer, death. We were all sorry for Carlo, the old familiar friend who had snapped at us for so many years. The mysterious mode of his death made us very uncomfortable. We wondered if Signor Brunoni could be at the bottom of this. He had apparently killed a canary with only a word of command. His will seemed of deadly force. Who knew but what he might yet be lingering in the neighborhood, willing all sorts of awful things? We whispered these fancies among ourselves in the evenings, but in the mornings our courage came back with the daylight. In a week's time, we had got over the shock of Carlo's death, all but Mrs. Jameson. She, poor thing, felt it as she had felt no event since her husband's death. Indeed, Miss Pole had remarked that as the Honorable Mr. Jameson drank a good deal and occasioned her much uneasiness, it was possible that Carlo's death might be the greater affliction. But there was always a tinge of cynicism in Miss Pole's remarks. However, one thing was clear and certain. It was necessary for Mrs. Jameson to have some change of scene. Mr. Mulliner was very impressive on this point, shaking his head whenever we inquired after his mistress, and speaking of her loss of appetite and bad nights very ominously, and with justice too. For if she had two characteristics in her natural state of health, they were a facility of eating and sleeping. If she could neither eat nor sleep, she must be indeed out of spirits and out of health. Lady Glenmire, who had evidently taken very kindly to Cranford, did not like the idea of Mrs. Jamieson's going to Cheltenham. More than once, she insinuated pretty plainly that it was Mr. Mulliner's doing. He had been much alarmed on the occasion of the house being attacked, and had since said, more than once, that he felt it a very responsible charge to have to defend so many women. Be that as it might, Mrs. Jameson went to Cheltenham, escorted by Mr. Mulliner, and Lady Glenmire remained in possession of the house. Her ostensible office was to take care that the maidservants did not pick up followers. She made a very pleasant-looking dragon. And as soon as it was arranged for her stay in Cranford, she found out that Mrs. Jameson's visit to Cheltenham was just the best thing in the world. She had let her house in Edinburgh, and was for the time without a house, so the charge of her sister-in-law's comfortable abode was very convenient and acceptable. Miss Pole was very much inclined to present herself as a heroine because of the decided steps she had taken in flying from the 2 men and 1 woman, whom she now entitled that murderous gang. She described their appearance in glowing colors, and I noticed that every time she went over the story, some fresh trait of villainy was added to their appearance, One was tall, and he grew to be gigantic in height before we had done with him. He, of course, had black hair, which by and by hung in matted locks over his forehead and down his back. The other was short and broad, and a hump sprouted out on his shoulder before we heard the last of him. He had red hair, which deepened into a carroty color, and she was almost sure he had a cast in one eye, a decided squint. As for the woman, her eyes glared, and she had a masculine look, a perfect virago. She was most probably a man dressed in woman's clothes. Afterwards, we heard of a beard on her chin, and a manly voice and a stride. If Miss Pole was delighted to recount the events of that afternoon to all who inquired, others were not so proud of their adventures in the robbery line. Mr. Hoggins, the surgeon, had been attacked at his own door by two ruffians who were concealed in the shadow of the porch. They had so effectually silenced him that he was robbed in the interval between ringing his bell and the servants answering it. Miss Pole was sure it would turn out that this robbery had been committed by what she called her men. She went the very day she heard the report to have her teeth examined and to question Mr. Hoggins. She came to us afterwards, so we heard what she had heard, straight and direct from the source, while we were yet in the excitement and flutter of the agitation caused by the first intelligence, for the event had only occurred the night before. Miss Pole began by sitting down with the decision of a person who has made up her mind as to the nature of life and the world. She declared that men will be men. Every mother's son of them, she continued, wishes to be considered Samson and Solomon rolled into one, too strong ever to be beaten, and too wise ever to be outwitted. She pointed out that they have always foreseen events, though they never tell one for a warning before the events happen. Her own father was a man, she said, and she knew the sex pretty well. She had talked herself out of breath. We would have been very glad to fill up the necessary pause as a chorus, but we did not exactly know what to say, or which man had suggested this diatribe against the sex. So we only joined in generally, with a grave shake of the head and a soft murmur that they were very incomprehensible. Certainly. She urged us to just think about it. She had undergone the risk of having one of her remaining teeth drawn, and yet, after all that, Mr. Hoggins was too much of a man to own that he was robbed last night. We all exclaimed in disbelief, questioning if he was truly not robbed. Miss Pole, angry that we could be for a moment imposed upon, urged us not to believe him. She insisted she believed he was robbed, just as Betty had told her, and that he was ashamed to own it. And to be sure, it was very silly of him to be robbed just at his own door. She was sure he felt that such a thing would not raise him in the eyes of Cranford society, and was anxious to conceal it. But he need not have tried to impose upon her, she said, by claiming she must have heard an exaggerated account of some petty theft of a neck of mutton which had been stolen out of the safe in his yard last week. He had had the impertinence to add that he believed that was taken by the cat. She had no doubt, she concluded, that if she could get to the bottom of it, it was that Irishman dressed as a woman who came spying about her house with the story about the starving children. After we had duly condemned the lack of candor which Mr. Hoggins had shown and abused men in general, taking him for the representative and type, we got round to the subject about which we had been talking when Miss Pole came in. Namely, how far, in the present disturbed state of the country, we could venture to accept an invitation which Miss Matty had just received from Mr. Forrester. She had invited us to come as usual and keep the anniversary of her wedding day by drinking tea with her at 5 o'clock and playing a quiet game of cards afterwards. Mr. Forrester had said that she asked us with some diffidence because she feared the roads were very unsafe. But she suggested that perhaps one of us would not object to take the sedan, and that the others, by walking briskly, might keep up with the long trot of the chairman. In this way, we might all arrive safely at Over Place, a small cluster of houses separated from Cranford by about 200 yards of a dark and lonely lane. There was no doubt that a similar note was awaiting Miss Pole at home, so her call was a very fortunate affair, as it enabled us to consult together. We would all much rather have declined this invitation. But we felt that it would not be quite kind to Mr. Forrester, who would otherwise be left to a solitary retrospect of her not very happy or fortunate life. Miss Matty and Miss Pole had been visitors on this occasion for many years, and now they gallantly determined to nail their colours to the mast and to go through Darkness Lane rather than fail in loyalty to their friend. But when the evening came, Miss Matty, who was voted into the chair as she had a cold, implored the chairman not to run away and leave her fastened up there to be murdered, whatever might happen. Even after they had promised, I saw her tighten her features into the stern determination of a martyr, and she gave me a melancholy and ominous shake of the head through the glass. However, we got there safely, only rather out of breath, for it was a race of who could trot hardest through Darkness Lane, and I am afraid poor Miss Matty was sadly jolted. Mrs. Forrester had made extra preparations in acknowledgment of our exertion in coming to see her through such dangers. The usual forms of genteel ignorance as to what her servants might send up were all gone through. Harmony and preference seemed likely to be the order of the evening. But this was interrupted by an interesting conversation that began I do not know how, but which had relation, of course, to the robbers who infested the neighborhood of Cranford. Having braved the dangers of Darkness Lane, we now had a little stock of reputation for courage to fall back upon. And I dare say we were also desirous of proving ourselves superior to men, particularly Mr. Hoggins, in the article of candor. So we began to relate our individual fears and the private precautions we each of us took. I owned that my pet apprehension was of eyes, seeing them looking at me and watching me, glittering out from some dull, flat, wooden surface. I confessed that if I dared to go up to my looking-glass when I was in a state of panic, I would certainly turn it round, with its back towards me, for fear of seeing eyes behind me looking out of the darkness. I saw Miss Matty nerving herself up for a confession, and at last out it came. She owned that ever since she had been a girl, she had dreaded being caught by her last leg, just as she was getting into bed, by someone concealed under it. She recalled that when she was younger and more active, she used to take a flying leap from a distance, and so bring both her legs up safely into bed at once. But this had always annoyed Deborah, who prided herself on getting into bed gracefully, and she had given it up in consequence. But now the old terror would often come over her, especially since Miss Pole's house had been attacked. We had all gotten quite to believe in the fact of the attack having taken place. And yet it was very unpleasant to think of looking under a bed and seeing a man concealed, with a great fierce face staring out. So she had thought of something. Perhaps I had noticed that she had told Martha to buy her a penny ball, such as children play with, and now she rolled this ball under the bed every night. If it came out on the other side, well and good. If not, she always took care to have her hand on the bell rope and meant to call out the names John and Harry, just as if she expected men who were servants to answer her ring. We all applauded this ingenious contrivance, and Miss Matty sank back into satisfied silence. She then gave a look at Mrs. Forrester, as if to ask for her private weakness. Mrs. Forrester looked askance at Miss Pole and tried to change the subject a little. She told us that she had borrowed a boy from one of the neighboring cottages. She had promised his parents 100 weight of coals at Christmas and his supper every evening, for the loan of him at nights. She had instructed him in his possible duties when he first came. Finding him sensible, she had given him the Major's sword, who was her late husband, and desired him to put it very carefully behind his pillow at night, turning the edge towards the head of the pillow. She was sure he was a sharp lad. For, spying out the Major's hat with its distinctive cocked shape, he had said that if he might have that to wear, he was sure he could frighten 2 Englishmen or 4 Frenchmen any day. But she had impressed upon him anew that he was to lose no time in putting on hats or anything else. If he heard any noise, he was to run at it with his drawn sword. Upon my suggesting that some accident might occur from such directions that were both slaughterous and indiscriminate, and that he might rush on Jenny getting up to wash and have spitted her before he had discovered that she was not a Frenchman, Mrs. Forrester replied that she did not think that was likely. For he was a very sound sleeper and generally had to be well shaken or have cold water thrown on him in a morning before they could rouse him. She sometimes thought such a dead sleep must be owing to the hearty suppers the poor lad ate, for he was half starved at home, and she told Jenny to see that he got a good meal at night. Still, this was no confession of Mrs. Forrester's peculiar timidity, and we urged her to tell us what she thought would frighten her more than anything. She paused, and stirred the fire, and snuffed the candles, and then, in a sounding whisper, she declared her greatest fear to be ghosts. She looked at Miss Pole as much as to say she had declared it and would stand by it. Such a look was a challenge in itself. Miss Pole came down upon her with arguments of indigestion, spectral illusions, optical delusions, and a great deal out of Dr. Ferrier and Dr. Hibbert besides. Miss Matty had rather a leaning to ghosts, as I have mentioned before, and what little she did say was all on Mrs. Forrester's side. Emboldened by this sympathy, Mrs. Forrester protested that ghosts were a part of her religion, and that surely she, the widow of a major in the army, knew what to be frightened at and what not. In short, I never saw Mrs. Forrester so warm either before or since, for she was a gentle, meek, and enduring old lady in most things. Not all the mulled elder wine that ever was made could this night wash out the remembrance of this difference between Miss Pole and her hostess. Indeed, when the elder wine was brought in, it gave rise to a new burst of discussion. For Jenny, The little maiden who staggered under the tray had to give evidence of having seen a ghost with her own eyes not so many nights ago in Darkness Lane, the very lane we were to go through on our way home. In spite of the uncomfortable feeling which this last consideration gave me, I could not help but be amused at Jenny's position. It was exceedingly like that of a witness being examined and cross-examined by two lawyers who are not at all scrupulous about asking leading questions. The conclusion I arrived at was that Jenny had certainly seen something beyond what a fit of indigestion would have caused. A lady all in white and without her head was what she deposed and adhered to. She was supported by a consciousness of the secret sympathy of her mistress under the withering scorn with which Miss Pole regarded her. And not only she, but many others had seen this headless lady who sat by the roadside wringing her hands as in deep grief. Mrs. Forrester looked at us from time to time with an air of conscious triumph, but then she did not have to pass through Darkness Lane before she could bury herself beneath her own familiar bed coverings. We preserved a discreet silence as to the headless lady while we were putting on our things to go home. There was no knowing how near the ghostly head and ears might be, or what spiritual connection they might be keeping up with the unhappy body in Darkness Lane. Therefore, even Miss Pole felt that it was as well not to speak lightly on such subjects, for fear of vexing or insulting that woebegone trunk. At least, so I conjecture. For instead of the busy clatter usual in the operation, we tied on our cloaks as sadly as mutes at a funeral. Miss Mattie drew the curtains round the windows of the chair to shut out disagreeable sights. And the men, either because they were in spirits that their labors were so nearly ended, or because they were going down the hill, set off at such a round and merry pace that it was all Miss Pole and I could do to keep up with them. She had breath for nothing beyond an imploring plea not to be left, uttered as she clutched my arm so tightly that I could not have quitted her, whether there was a ghost or no ghost. What a relief it was when the men, weary of their burden and their quick trot, stopped just where Headingley Causeway branches off from Darkness Lane. Miss Pole unloosed me and caught at one of the men. She asked if they could not take Miss Mattie round by way of Headingley Causeway, explaining that the pavement in Darkness Lane jolted so, and she was not very strong. A smothered voice was then heard from the inside of the chair, praying to go on and asking what the matter was. The voice offered 6 pence more to go on very fast and begged them not to stop there. Miss Pole, with a dignity that trembled, then offered a shilling if they would go by Headingley Causeway. The two men grunted in agreement and took up the chair. They went along the causeway, which certainly answered Miss Pole's kind purpose of saving Miss Mattie's bones, for it was covered with soft, thick mud. Even a fall there would have been easy until the getting up came, when there might have been some difficulty in extrication. Chapter 11. The next morning I met Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole setting out on a long walk. They were going to find some old woman who was famous in the neighborhood for her skill in knitting woolen stockings. Miss Pole spoke to me with a smile that was half kind and half contemptuous. She said she had just been telling Lady Glenmire of our poor friend Mrs. Forrester and her terror of ghosts. She explained that it comes from living so much alone and listening to the frightening stories of that maid, Jenny of hers. She was so calm and so much above superstitious fears herself that I was almost ashamed to say how glad I had been of her proposition about the Headingley Causeway the night before. and so I turned the conversation to something else. In the afternoon, Miss Pole called on Miss Mattie to tell her of the adventure, the real adventure they had met with on their morning's walk. They had been perplexed about the exact path to take across the fields to find the knitting old woman. They had stopped to inquire at a little public house on the side of the road that led to London, about 3 miles from Cranford. The good woman of the house had asked them to sit down and rest themselves while she fetched her husband, who could direct them better than she could. And while they were sitting in the sanded parlor, a little girl came in. They thought that she belonged to the landlady and began some trifling conversation with her. But on the landlady's return, she told them that the little thing was the only child of a couple who were staying in the house. And then she began a long story, from which Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole could only gather 1 or 2 decided facts. It seemed that, about 6 weeks ago, a light spring cart had broken down just before their door. In it, there were 2 men, 1 woman, and this child. One of the men was seriously hurt. He had no broken bones, but was only shaken, as the landlady called it. But he had probably sustained some severe internal injury, for he had languished in their house ever since, attended by his wife, the mother of this little girl. Miss Pole had asked what he was and what he looked like, and the landlady had answered that he was not like a gentleman, nor yet like a common person. If it had not been that he and his wife were such decent, quiet people, she could almost have thought he was a mountebank or something of that kind. For they had a great box in the cart, full of she did not know what. She had helped to unpack it and take out their linen and clothes, when the other man, who she believed was his twin brother, had gone off with the horse and cart. Miss Pole had begun to have her suspicions at this point. She expressed her idea that it was rather strange that the box and cart and horse and all should have disappeared. But good Mrs. Roberts, the landlady, seemed to have become quite indignant at Miss Pole's implied suggestion. In fact, Miss Pole said she was as angry as if Miss Pole had told her that she herself was a swindler. As the best way of convincing the ladies, she thought to beg them to see the wife. And as Miss Pole said, there was no doubting the honest, worn, and bronzed face of the woman. At the first tender word from Lady Glenmire, she burst into tears, which she was too weak to check until some word from the landlady made her swallow down her sobs, in order that she might testify to the Christian kindness shown by Mr. and Mrs. Roberts. Miss Pole came round with a swing to as vehement a belief in the sorrowful tale as she had been skeptical before. And as a proof of this, her energy on behalf of the poor sufferer was not at all daunted when she found out that he, and no other, was our Signor Brunoni, to whom all Cranford had been attributing all manner of evil these past 6 weeks. Yes, his wife said his proper name was Samuel Brown. She called him Sam, but to the last we preferred calling him the Signor, as it sounded so much better. The end of their conversation with the Signora Brunoni was that it was agreed that he should be placed under medical advice. For any expense incurred in procuring this, Lady Glenmire promised to hold herself responsible. She had accordingly gone to Mr. Hoggins to beg him to ride over to the Rising Sunday Inn that very afternoon and examine into the Signor's real state. And, as Miss Pole said, If it was desirable to remove him to Cranford to be more immediately under the eye of Mr. Hoggins, she would undertake to see for lodgings and arrange about the rent. Mrs. Roberts had been as kind as could be all throughout, but it was evident that their long residence there had been a slight inconvenience. Before Miss Pole left us, Miss Mattie and I were as full of the morning's adventure as she was. We talked about it all the evening, turning it in every possible light. And we went to bed anxious for the morning, when we should surely hear from someone what Mr. Hoggins thought and recommended. For, as Miss Mattie observed, though Mr. Hoggins did use slang and called the game of preference by a shortened name, she believed he was a very worthy man and a very clever surgeon. Indeed, we were rather proud of our doctor at Cranford, as a doctor. We often wished, when we heard of Queen Adelaide or the Duke of Wellington being ill, that they would send for Mr. Hoggins. But on consideration, we were rather glad they did not. For if we were ailing, what should we do if Mr. Hoggins had been appointed a physician in ordinary to the royal family? As a surgeon, we were proud of him, but as a man, or rather, as a gentleman, we could only shake our heads over his name and himself. We wish that he had read Lord Chesterfield's letters in the days when his manners were susceptible of improvement. Nevertheless, we all regarded his dictum in the signor's case as infallible. And when he said that with care and attention he might rally, we had no more fear for him. But, although we had no more fear, everybody did as much as if there was great cause for anxiety, as indeed there was until Mr. Hoggins took charge of him. Miss Pole looked out for clean and comfortable, if homely, lodgings. Miss Mattie sent the sedan chair for him, and Martha and I aired it well before it left Cranford. We did this by holding a warming pan full of hot coals in it, and then shutting it up close, smoke and all, until the time when he should get into it at the Rising Sunday Inn. Lady Glenmire undertook the medical department under the directions of Mr. Hoggins. She rummaged up all of Mrs. Jameson's medicine glasses and spoons and small tables for the bedside, in a free and easy way that made Miss Mattie feel a little anxious as to what that lady and Mr. Mulliner might say if they knew. Mrs. Forrester made some of the bread jelly for which she was so famous, to have ready as a refreshment in the lodgings when he should arrive. A present of this bread jelly was the highest mark of favor dear Mrs. Forrester could confer. Miss Pole had once asked her for the recipe, but she had met with a very decided rebuff. That lady had told her that she could not part with it to anyone during her life, and that after her death it was bequeathed, as her executors would find, to Miss Mattie. What Miss Mattie, or as Mrs. Forrester called her, Miss Matilda Jenkins, might choose to do with the recipe when it came into her possession, whether to make it public or to hand it down as an heirloom, she did not know, nor would she dictate. And a mold of this admirable, digestible, unique bread jelly was sent by Mrs. Forrester to our poor sick conjurer. Who says that the aristocracy are proud? Here was a lady who was a Tyrrell by birth, and descended from the great Sir Walter that shot King Rufus. A woman in whose veins ran the blood of him who murdered the little princes in the Tower, going every day to see what dainty dishes she could prepare for Samuel Brown, a mountebank. But indeed, it was wonderful to see what kind feelings were called out by this poor man's coming amongst us. And also wonderful to see how the Great Cranford Panic, which had been occasioned by his first coming in his Turkish dress, melted away into thin air on his second coming, pale and feeble, and with his heavy, filmy eyes that only brightened a very little when they fell upon the countenance of his faithful wife or their pale and sorrowful little girl. Somehow we all forgot to be afraid. I dare say it was the discovery that he, who had first excited our love of the marvelous by his unprecedented arts, had not sufficient gifts for everyday life to manage a shying horse. This made us feel as if we were ourselves again. Miss Pole came with her little basket at all hours of the evening, as if her lonely house and the unfrequented road to it had never been infested by that murderous gang she had described. Mrs. Forrester said she thought that neither Jenny nor she need mind the headless lady who wept and wailed in Darkness Lane, for surely the power was never given to such beings to harm those who went about to try to do what little good was in their power. To this, Jenny tremblingly assented, but the mistress's theory had little effect on the maid's practice until she had sewn 2 pieces of red flannel in the shape of a cross on her inner garment. I found Miss Mattie covering her penny ball, the ball that she used to roll under her bed, with brightly colored worsted and rainbow stripes. She told me that her heart was sad for that little careworn child. She observed that although her father was a conjurer, the girl looked as if she had never had a good game of play in her life. She recalled making very pretty balls in this way when she was a girl and thought she would try to make this one smart and take it to Phoebe that afternoon. She then concluded that the gang must have left the neighborhood, for one did not hear any more of their violence and robbery now. We were all of us far too full of the signor's precarious state to talk either about robbers or ghosts. Indeed, Lady Glenmire said she had never heard of any actual robberies, except that 2 little boys had stolen some apples from Farmer Benson's orchard and that some eggs had been missed on a market day from the stall of the widow Hayward. But that was expecting too much of us. We could not acknowledge that we had only had this small foundation for all our panic. Miss Pole drew herself up at this remark from Lady Glenmire. She said that she wished she could agree with her as to the very small reason they had had for alarm. But she could not, she explained, with the recollection of a man disguised as a woman who had endeavored to force himself into her house with the knowledge of the footprints seen on Mrs. Jameson's flower borders, and with the fact of the audacious robbery committed on Mr. Hoggins. But here Lady Glenmire broke in with a very strong expression of doubt as to whether this last story was not an entire fabrication founded upon the theft of a cat. She grew so red while she was saying all this that I was not surprised at Miss Pole's manner of bridling up. I am certain, if Lady Glenmire had not been a woman of her rank, we should have had a more emphatic contradiction than the non-committal phrases which were all that she ventured upon in her presence. But when she was gone, Miss Pole began a long congratulation to Miss Mattie that so far they had escaped marriage, which she noticed always made people credulous to the last degree. Indeed, she thought it argued great natural credulity in a woman if she could not keep herself from being married. And in what Lady Glenmire had said about the robbery of Mr. Hoggins, she remarked, they had a specimen of what people came to if they gave way to such a weakness. Evidently, Lady Glenmire would swallow anything if she could believe the poor, made-up story about a neck of mutton and a pussy with which he had tried to impose on Miss Pole, only she had always been on her guard against believing too much of what men said. We were thankful, as Miss Pole desired us to be, that we had never been married, but I think, of the two, we were even more thankful that the robbers had left Cranford. At least I judged so from a speech of Miss Mattie's that evening as we sat over the fire. She evidently looked upon her husband as a great protector against thieves, burglars, and ghosts. She said that she did not think that she should dare to be always warning young people against matrimony, as Miss Pole did continually. To be sure, she continued, marriage was a risk, as she saw now that she had had some experience. But she remembered the time when she had looked forward to being married as much as anyone. She quickly checked herself, as if afraid of having admitted too much, and said it was not any particular person she had in mind. It was only the old story, she explained, of ladies always saying, "when I marry," and gentlemen saying, "if I marry." It was a joke spoken in rather a sad tone, and I doubt if either of us smiled, but I could not see Miss Mattie's face by the flickering firelight. In a little while, she continued. She confessed that, after all, she had not told the truth. It was so long ago, and no one ever knew how much she thought of it at the time, unless, indeed, her dear mother had guessed. But she could say that there was a time when she did not think she would be only Miss Mattie Jenkins all her life. For even if she were to meet someone who wished to marry her now, as Miss Pole often warned, she could not take him. She hoped he would not take it too much to heart, but she could not take him or anyone but the person she once thought she would be married to. And he was dead and gone, and he never knew how it all came about that she had said no when she had thought about it many and many a time. She trailed off, saying it was no matter what she thought, that God ordains it all, and that she was very happy. No one, she continued, taking my hand and holding it in hers, had such kind friends as she. If I had never known of Mr. Holbrook, I could have said something in this pause, but as I had, I could not think of anything that would come in naturally, and so we both kept silence for a little time. Miss Mattie then began to speak of how her father once made them keep a diary in 2 columns. On one side they were to put down in the morning what they thought would be the course of the coming day, and at night they were to put down on the other side what really had happened. She remarked that it would be to some people rather a sad way of telling their lives, and a tear dropped upon my hand at these words. She added that she did not mean her own life had been sad, only so very different to what she had expected. She remembered one winter's evening, sitting over their bedroom fire with Deborah as if it were yesterday. They were both planning their future lives, though only Deborah talked about it. She said she should like to marry an archdeacon and write his charges. And yet, she had never been married, and for aught I know, never spoke to an unmarried archdeacon in her life. Miss Mattie had never been ambitious, nor could she have written charges, but she thought she could manage a house, as her mother used to call her right hand. And she was always so fond of little children, the shyest babies would stretch out their little arms to come to her. When she was a girl, she spent half her leisure time nursing in the neighboring cottages. But she did not know how it was that when she grew sad and grave, a year or 2 after this time, the little things drew back from her. She was afraid she had lost the knack, though she was just as fond of children as ever, and had a strange yearning at her heart whenever she saw a mother with her baby in her arms. By a sudden blaze which sprang up from the fire, I saw that her eyes were full of tears as she gazed intently on some vision of what might have been. She confessed that she sometimes dreamed that she had a little child, always the same little girl of about 2 years old. The child never grew older, though she had dreamt about her for many years. She did not think she ever dreamt of any words or sound the child made. She was very noiseless and still. But she came to her when she was very sorry or very glad, and she had wakened with the clasp of her dear little arms round her neck. Only last night, perhaps because she had gone to sleep thinking of the ball for Phoebe, her little darling had come in her dream and put up her mouth to be kissed, just as she had seen real babies do. But she dismissed all this as nonsense and urged me not to be frightened by Miss Pole from being married. She could fancy, she said, that it may be a very happy state, and that a little credulity helps one on through life very smoothly, better than always doubting and seeing difficulties and disagreeables in everything. If I had been inclined to be daunted from matrimony, it would not have been Miss Pole who would have done it. It would have been the lot of poor Signor Brunoni and his wife. And yet again, it was an encouragement to see how, through all their cares and sorrows, they thought of each other and not of themselves, and how keen their joys were if they only passed through each other, or through the little Phoebe. The Signora, or Mrs. Brown as we found out she preferred to be called, told me one day a good deal about their lives up to this period. It began by my asking her whether Miss Pole's story of the twin brothers were true. It sounded so wonderful a likeness that I should have had my doubts if Miss Pole had not been unmarried. But Mrs. Brown said it was quite true. She explained that her brother-in-law was by many taken for her husband, which was of great assistance to them in their profession. Though, she continued, she could not conceive how people could mistake Thomas for the real Signor Brunoni, but he said they did, so she supposed she must believe him. She added that he was a very good man, and she was not sure how they would have paid their bill at the Rising Sunday Inn, but for the money he sent. But people must know very little about art if they can take him for her husband. She explained that in the ball trick, where her husband spreads his fingers wide and throws out his little finger with quite an air and a grace, Thomas just clumps up his hand like a fist and might have ever so many balls hidden in it. Besides, she concluded, he has never been in India and knows nothing of the proper way to sit with a turban. I was rather astonished and asked if she herself had been in India. She confirmed that she had been in India for many a year. She explained that her husband, Sam, was a sergeant in the 31st Regiment. When the regiment was ordered to India, she drew a lot to go, and she was more thankful than she could say. It seemed as if it would only be a slow death to her to part from her husband. But, she confided, if she had known all, she did not know whether she would not rather have died there and then than gone through what she had done since. To be sure, she had been able to comfort Sam and to be with him, but she had lost 6 children. She looked up at me as she said this, with those strange eyes that I have never noticed but in mothers of dead children, with a kind of wild look in them, as if seeking for what they never more might find. She repeated that yes, 6 children had died off, like little buds nipped untimely in that cruel India. She thought, as each died, that she never could and never would love a child again. But when the next came, it had not only its own love, but the deeper love that came from the thoughts of its little dead brothers and sisters. She recalled telling her husband, when Phoebe was coming, that she would leave him when the child was born, and she was strong. It would cut her heart cruelly, she knew, but if this baby died too, she would go mad. The madness was in her now, she had told him, but if he let her go down to Calcutta, carrying her baby step by step, it would perhaps work itself off. She vowed that she would save and hoard and beg and even die to get a passage home to England where their baby might live. And God bless him, she said, for he told her she might go. He saved up his pay, and she saved every pice she could get from washing or any other way. When Phoebe came, and she grew strong again, she set off. She described the journey as very lonely, through thick forests and along by the river's side, though the flowing noise sounded like home to her, as she had been brought up near the Avon in Warwickshire. From station to station, from Indian village to village, she went along carrying her child. She told me of a little picture she had seen, one belonging to an officer's lady, of the Virgin and the little Savior. When she went to bid goodbye to this lady, for whom she had washed, the lady cried sadly, for she, too, had lost her children, and she was bold enough to ask for the print. The lady cried the more, and said her children were with that little blessed Jesus, and gave it to her. She told her it had been painted on the bottom of a cask, which gave it that round shape. She confessed that when her body was weary and her heart was sick, for there were times she doubted if she could ever reach home, she would take out that picture and look at it, until she could have thought the mother spoke to her and comforted her, and the native people were very kind. They could not understand one another, but they saw her baby on her breast, and came out to her, and brought her rice and milk, and sometimes flowers. She still had some of the flowers, dried. Then, the next morning, she would be tired, and they would want her to stay, trying to frighten her from going into the deep woods. But it seemed to her as if death was following her to take her baby away, and as if she must go on and on. She thought how God had cared for mothers ever since the world was made, and would care for her. So she bade them goodbye, and set off afresh. And once, when her baby was ill and they both needed rest, he had led her to a place where she found a kind Englishman lived, right in the midst of the native people. I asked if she had reached Calcutta safely at last. She confirmed that she had, and with great emotion, she described the moment she knew she had only 2 days' journey left. It might have been idolatry, she could not tell, but she was near one of the native temples and went into it with her baby to thank God for his great mercy. It seemed to her that where others had prayed before to their God, in their joy or in their agony, was of itself a sacred place. She then got a position as a servant to a lady who was an invalid who grew quite fond of her baby aboard the ship, and in 2 years' time, Sam earned his discharge and came home to her and to their child. Then he had to fix on a trade, but he knew of none. Once, a long time ago, he had learnt some tricks from an Indian juggler, so he set up conjuring. It answered so well that he took Thomas to help him, as his man, not as another conjurer, though Thomas had now set up on his own. She explained that the likeness between the twins had been a great help to them and had made a good many tricks go off well that they had made up together. And Thomas was a good brother, only he did not have the fine carriage of her husband. so she could not imagine how he could be taken for Signor Brunoni himself, as he said he was. I expressed my sympathy for poor little Phoebe, my thoughts going back to the baby she had carried all those 100 miles. Mrs. Brown agreed, saying she had never thought she would have reared her, especially when she fell ill at a place called Chundarabadad. But, she explained, a good, kind Aga Jenkins had taken them in, which she believed was the very saving of her. My heart leaped at the name. I repeated the name Jenkins to be sure. She confirmed it, yes, Jenkins. She added that she would think all people of that name were kind, for here was that nice old lady who came every day to take Phoebe for a walk. But an idea had flashed through my head. Could the Aga Jenkins be the lost Peter? It was true he was reported by many to be dead. But it was equally true that some had said he had arrived at the dignity of the Great Lama of Tibet. Miss Mattie thought he was alive. I decided I would make further inquiry.